Chapter 22 Farm. The first thing Scarlet felt as she came back to the waking world was the warmth of a thick, soft blankets covering her body. It was a strange sensation, given that the very last thing she remembered feeling was unfathomable exhaustion and the cold, hard ground rubbing painfully against her battered flesh as she collapsed onto it. The second thing she felt was the soreness in her muscles and the burn in her legs. It wasn't nearly as intense as she remembered it being, giving her the impression that her wounds must have been treated. Slowly, she lifted her forelegs and felt over them, over each other, and over her chest. Sure enough, she felt bandages bound around her to cover her wounds and prevent them from bleeding any further. But who had treated her? It couldn't have been Len's. They had run out of bandages before they even began to run. The run. Scarlet's eyes snapped open as she involuntarily gasped through clenched teeth. Primrose! What had happened to her? She immediately looked around and tried to sit up, but a sharp flare of pain in her side sent her falling back onto the pillow with a hiss and a groan of pain. Her eyes screwed themselves shut as she forced herself to breathe, and soon enough the pain died down. Then she opened her eyes again and looked around more slowly. She was resting in one of two simple beds that occupied a small, square-shaped room. The walls were made of wood logs, while the floor was made of cobblestone that didn't appear to have been cleaned all that recently. An end table was right by her bed. An unlit candle rested on it along with a wooden bowl, though Scarlet could not see its contents from here. A shuttered window was set into the wall above the table, through which Scarlet could make out the sounds of birds chirping and distant, muffled voices calling to one another. Her eyes eventually settled on the only other bed in the room, while she wondered if she was alone. What she saw made her smile with unbounded relief, and she couldn't repress a heavy sigh. For there, resting on her side under the blankets, alive, was Primrose.
We must have made it then,
Scarlet thought to herself, slowly peeling the blankets off of her body with her hooves so she could assess her own damage. She cringed when she saw just how much of her was covered in bandages. Both of her forelegs were wrapped from the elbows up, and pretty much her entire barrel had received similar treatment. She looked like a mummy from old somnambulant hieroglyphs. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a dust-brown earth pony stallion stepped in. His mane and tail were both short but scraggly, colored a vibrant dark red. A bushy mustache protruded from his upper lip that Scarlet could only imagine would soak up a lot of milk. He had a wide-brimmed leather hat on his head and a dark blue bandana hanging from his neck. His eyes were focused first on Primrose, but quickly flew to Scarlet when he realized that she was awake. His emerald green eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, well, howdy, ma'am," he greeted, his voice perky and thickly accented. "I wasn't expecting y'all to be awake yet."
"Well, I am,"
Scarlet replied, before slowly moving to sit up, careful not to agitate her injuries like she had before. The stallion was at her side in a heartbeat, his hoof gently pushing her back down by her shoulder. "Whoa, hey, easy now, miss," he said soothingly until she was on her back again. "Just 'cause you're awake doesn't mean you're ready to be up and about just yet. Y'all were all pretty banged up when you came in." Scarlet eyed his hooves as he pulled back. They were rough and strong, and she could tell that he could put a lot of power into them if he wanted. She sighed and nodded, resigning herself to his treatment.
"Fine. What happened to me?"
The stallion pondered her for a moment before turning back and adjusting his hat. "Well, that friend of yours, Lynn's, came running into town a couple days ago at sunset, hollering and screaming that he needed help. Wife heard the commotion and went running over to see what was what, and she brought y'all back here to our house and took care of you." Scarlet blinked, her muzzle morphing into a frown.
I'm sorry, but A couple of days?
She asked, surprised. The stallion nodded. Yes, ma'am. Y'all were on death's door, he said, his tone noticeably grimmer. Slash wounds, exhaustion, bruises, muscle strain. If y'all had shown up even a minute later, I don't think you'd be alive right now. Either of you. Scarlet's eyes drifted past the stallion to Primrose, concern building in her chest. She licked her lips and spoke slowly.
Is she going to be all right?
The stallion turned to the slumbering foal, a faraway look in his eyes. Aye. We reckon she'll make a full recovery. She's a tough little one, Primrose is. Scarlet's attention became fixated fully to the stallion, the realization dawning on her.
Wait, you know her name? Then you must be...
The stallion took off his hat and held it to his chest as he dipped into a polite bow. Sure as sugar. Name's Applejuice, at your service. You must be Scarlet Frost, and that... He turned and smiled down at Primrose again. That there's Primrose. Scarlet was quiet for a few seconds. Eventually, she looked away, regret slowly starting to claw at her heart.
She used to stay with you, didn't she?
Applejuice nodded, adjusting his hat and heading over to the end table. Sure did. Stuck with us for around 6 months. Got along real well with my boy Apple Star. He started to explain before picking up the bowl and bringing it down to Scarlet's face. It's water. Drink up. You must be thirsty. Scarlet complied, taking a few healthy gulps and sighing with satisfaction when it was pulled away. She hadn't realized just how dry and rugged her throat had been until that moment.
Thank you,
she said, resting her head back. Applejuice smiled. My pleasure, ma'am, he said before peeling back her blankets himself and studying her bandages. He gave a low, contemplative hum before nodding in satisfaction and putting the blankets back. Right. I think your bandages are good for now. The wind must have changed them this morning. Scarlet watched as he stood up from her and went over to Primrose's bed. Her eyes widened when he pulled the foal's blankets back, revealing the bandages wrapped around her torso. The deep red coloration was far worse than on Scarlet's, staining almost the entirety of her chest. Applejuice sighed and returned the blankets to their original place. Poor thing. No pony deserves what she's been through. Scarlet sighed and looked away, guilt and regret gnawing at her heart even more than before.
Forgive me,
she suddenly blurted without even thinking about it.
It's my fault. I allowed this to happen.
Nah. Applejuice shook his head and sat down on the edge of Prim's bed. He reached down and gently brushed some of her long and wild mane out of her face, his lips curling into a tender smile. Weren't your fault. According to Lenz, y'all saved her life. More than once, as a matter of fact. His smile faded, and he looked at Scarlet directly. Although I gotta admit to being curious. How did you meet her? Why are you traveling together? Scarlet winced and closed her eyes. She hesitated for a moment before speaking up.
I found her hiding in my wine cellar in Swan Run one night. She was trying to get out of the rain that was falling, and my home was her choice. She must have gotten startled by a thunderclap or something. She shattered some of the older bottles. Some shards got stuck in her legs, and I had to clean her up. After that, we were attacked by a pony who has been following her. A Nightblade named Silent Edge.
She shuddered as memories from that night briefly flickered before her eyes.
We barely got out with our lives. We figured that Silent must have been after her because of her lamp, and so I thought we should go to some pony who might know more about it.
I'm guessing that'd be Lynn's then, Applejuice noted. He sure knows a lot. Keeps spewing all kinds of trivia. He's taking answering all kinds of questions my boy has.
Yes,
Scarlet confirmed with a nod.
He and I go way back. I thought he could tell us more about the lamp so we could figure out what to do next, but we were attacked again before he had a chance. We ran together and we planned to come here anyway for shelter. But
Silent caught up to you, Applejuice summarized, drawing a slow nod out of Scarlet. He hummed in thought before rising from his seated position and trotting over to her bedside. She looked up at him and the two locked gazes for a time. Then Applejuice smiled down at her. Well, thank you kindly for taking care of Prim for us. We'd all thought she'd died after she left. Scarlet was quiet for a moment, before deciding it was her turn to ask some questions.
What about you? How do you know her?
Applejuice glanced back at Prim, his ears drooping somewhat. Oh, shucks. It was about 2 years ago, I think. Something like that. It was in the middle of winter, and the snows were a lot worse than usual. He began, bringing over the chair and sitting down in it. And one night, during a particularly bad blizzard, my boy was watching the snow coming down through the window while Wind and I were making up supper. Then, out of nowhere, he starts hollering and tells us that there's this little filly trudging through the snow outside. The stallion looked over at Primrose again, his ears folding back entirely and deep sympathy creeping into his voice. First, we thought maybe she was some pony else's. We got a lot of foals in this community, you know, but didn't take us long to realize we didn't recognize her. And then we saw how skinny she was. Like a twig. And out of nowhere, she just collapsed, face down. I ran out and brought her inside to warm her up quick as I could. Poor thing. She was so skinny I was worried I might break her like a little twig just carrying her inside on my back. Could see her ribs showing and everything. Wind set to work patching her up, and I went out once the snows calmed down to talk to every pony else and see where she came from.
And of course no pony knew her,
Scarlet deduced. Nope, not a soul. So we let her stay in the spare bedroom and figured we'd ask her when she woke up. Applejuice went on. His brow furrowed and he sighed quietly, looking down at the floor. Thing is, when she woke up, she weren't in a talking mood. She was angry, aggressive. Tried to bite us anytime we got close, shouted at us to leave her alone, screamed for us to let her go, that kind of thing. She was like a little monster. He scratched the back of his head and looked over at Primrose again. Looking back on it, I think she was trying to push us away. Poor Phil had lost so much so fast, she must have been scared of having any pony else, 'cause she thought she'd lose him too. Scarlet eyed Primrose, her heart withering in her chest at this new information.
What happened next?
She asked after a few seconds of quiet.
You said she got along well with your son earlier.
Applejuice adjusted his hat and nodded. Aye, that she did. See, my boy's tough, but at the time, he was dumb as a bag of hammers, let me tell you. Didn't ever want to take no for an answer from her, you see. He explained, briefly chuckling at his description of his son's prior intelligence. But I think that stubborn insistence of his was what won out in the end. While Prim was recovering, he kept going up to her, talking to her, showing her his toys, full stuff. She brushed him off at first, but eventually she began to open up to him. Told him her name, for one thing. We didn't even have that to go by at first. And showed him her lamp. Eventually, she began to relax and lighten up around the rest of us. Of course, she had plenty of time. We weren't just going to let her wander off into the world when the snows were still coming down so hard, and she was still recovering. By the time the snow melted and spring rolled around, she was practically part of the family. He smiled at the memory, chuckling to himself. Played with my boy, talked with us, asked us questions. She even helped us where she could. And once she opened up, she was just the sweetest little thing, I swear. Didn't even look like she wanted to go anymore.
Scarlet's face slowly lit up with a small smile, a gentle warmth filling her veins. She was lucky to find you.
Well, we were lucky we saw her, Albajuice added before continuing on. She had a few quirks, though. She was terribly shy around every pony but us, and she was weak as a wet noodle, and had more scars than any foal ought to have, both on her body and in her mind. Now, I ain't no genius or nothing, but even I could tell that the little girl was scared of something none of us knew about.
Silent Edge,
Scarlet clarified, her eyes narrowing with disdain and hatred.
The Nightblade. He's been chasing her for 5 years, long before she ever met you.
That's probably why she left then.
Scarlet tilted her head, her anger swiftly being replaced with solemn curiosity. What happened?
Albajuice sighed, took off his hat and set it off to one side. Well, see, one day I sat down with my boy and my wife, and we talked, and eventually we decided that we wanted Prim to stay. We wanted her to join the family. I mean, she was practically our kid already in every way but blood. We wanted to make it official. So we asked her, and, well, she was reluctant at first, but in the end she said yes. We had a nice big meal that night to celebrate. Practically a buffet. She seemed so happy. It was like a whole world of weight had been taken off her little shoulders.
He looked down at the floor, his ears folding back again.
But, well, a few weeks later, we all woke up and suddenly Prim had just up and gone. Ran off in the middle of the night, only left us a note saying that she was sorry, but that she had to go. Told us she loved us and would miss us and that she'd come back someday, but it never happened. Until you brought her back.
Albajuice looked up at Scarlet, his green eyes boring into her amethyst ones. He gave her a large, warm smile.
So thank you, miss. Thank you for bringing our little Rose back. And thank you again for saving her life. I don't know how I can ever repay you.
Think nothing of it, Scarlet replied with a smile of her own. And thank you for tending to her wounds. I may have only known her for a fraction of the time you did, but...
She looked at the foal again, her vision starting to haze over with tears of joy as she fully embraced the fact that she was alive.
In that time, I have come to care deeply about her.
I can tell, ma'am. Believe me.
Albajuice replied before standing up and pushing the chair back into the corner.
Anywho, Wendell want to know you're awake, and so will Ends. You just lay down and get some more rest, yeah?
Do I have a choice?
Scarlet asked with a roll of her eyes. Well, I mean, sure. He replied with his hoof on the handle. Could choose to get up and wander around, but you risk hurting yourself and opening your wounds up again.
That isn't a particularly compelling alternative,
Scarlet deadpanned. The stallion gave a quick bark of laughter before replacing his head on his head. And that's why you rest up, he declared before stepping outside, although this time he left the door open. Scarlet listened as the sound of his hip steps faded away, before the sound of another door opening was heard. When it shut, the house was plunged into silence, save for the quiet breaths Primrose let out with every exhale. Scarlet looked over at the filly. Her face wasn't peaceful, so to speak, but compared to the near-death grimace she had been wearing before, this was a significant improvement. Although a few strands of her purple mane had fallen in front of her face again, making her eyelids twitch with irritation. With a tender smile, Scarlet lit her horn with magic and gently brushed the locks back and behind Primrose's ear. With the annoyance gone, Scarlet watched as finally, the foal smiled.